Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight, we begin a journey across a vast and untamed continent, a land of endless forests stretching farther than the eye could see. Great rivers flowing toward distant oceans, snow-covered mountains rising above the clouds, golden prairies where millions of buffalo once roamed, and ancient deserts glowing beneath the evening sun. Long before railroads crossed the plains, long before frontier towns appeared beneath the western sky, long before the United States became a nation, this land was already home to hundreds of thriving native nations. Each possessed its own language, its own traditions, its own stories, and its own understanding of the world. Tonight we explore one of the longest and most remarkable chapters in American history, the story of the American Indian Wars. For more than 3 centuries, from the earliest English settlements on the Atlantic coast to the closing years of the 19th century, native nations, European empires, and eventually the United States found themselves drawn into an ever-changing series of conflicts, alliances, misunderstandings, and extraordinary acts of courage. It is a story often told through battles, but tonight we will tell it differently. This is not simply the story of war, it is the story of people, families building homes beside rivers that had sustained them for countless generations, hunters following the great buffalo herds across the endless plains, children learning the traditions of their ancestors around evening campfires, European settlers searching for opportunity in unfamiliar lands, explorers traveling beyond the edge of every known map, soldiers marching into landscapes they had never imagined, and leaders on every side making decisions that would shape the future of an entire continent. History is rarely simple. There are no easy heroes, no easy villains, only human beings living through difficult times. Throughout this journey, we will move carefully and respectfully through the events that unfolded over hundreds of years. We will explore the hopes that inspired people, the fears that guided them, and the choices that changed countless lives forever. Along the way, we will walk through towering pine forests where morning mist clung to the trees. We will paddle along quiet rivers reflecting the colors of dawn. We will ride across rolling grasslands stretching toward distant horizons. We will stand beneath enormous western skies where the stars appeared brighter than anywhere else on Earth. We will visit thriving native villages, peaceful farming communities, busy colonial settlements, remote frontier forts, and the vast open plains that became home to some of history's most famous warriors. Imagine North America before highways, before cities, before fences divided the landscape. Imagine hearing nothing but birdsong drifting through ancient forests, the gentle movement of water along a riverbank, or the distant thunder of buffalo herds moving across the prairie. It was a quieter world, a slower world, a world where the rhythm of life followed the changing seasons. Spring brought new growth, summer filled the forests with life, autumn covered the valleys with brilliant shades of gold and crimson, winter blanketed the mountains in snow and transformed rivers into silent ribbons of ice. For thousands of years, people adapted beautifully to these changing landscapes. Some built villages beside fertile rivers. Others followed migrating animals across enormous distances. Some became remarkable farmers. Others became expert horsemen after horses returned to North America during the 16th century. Every nation developed its own customs, beliefs, and way of life. There was no single Native American culture. There were hundreds, each unique, each deeply connected to the land they called home. This remarkable diversity often surprises people today. More than 500 distinct nations lived across North America. Hundreds of different languages echoed through forests, plains, mountains, deserts, and coastlines. Some communities built enormous earthen cities centuries before Europeans arrived. Others lived within carefully planned farming villages protected by wooden palisades. Along the Pacific Northwest, great cedar houses overlooked the ocean. Far to the southwest, stone pueblos stood beneath towering red cliffs. Across the Great Plains, entire communities followed the buffalo herds across endless grasslands. Every landscape shaped the people who lived there, just as every people shaped the landscape in return. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic Ocean, another world was changing. European kingdoms searched for new trade routes. Ships grew larger, maps expanded, explorers sailed farther than ever before. They sought wealth, opportunity, knowledge, and sometimes entirely new worlds. Few could have imagined how completely these two worlds would soon meet, or how profoundly both would change because of that meeting. Before we continue our journey into this remarkable chapter of history, I have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy peaceful history documentaries like this one, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to Whispered History. Every like helps these relaxing history journeys reach more people who enjoy learning about the past before drifting off to sleep. Every comment tells YouTube that thoughtful, slow-paced history still has a place in today's world. And by subscribing, you'll never miss another quiet evening exploring forgotten civilizations, legendary frontiers, ancient kingdoms, remarkable people, and the extraordinary stories that shaped our world. Now, take a slow, comfortable breath. Allow your shoulders to relax. Dim the lights around you. Settle comfortably beneath a warm blanket or into your favorite chair. Let the sounds of today slowly fade into the distance. Instead, imagine hearing a gentle breeze moving through tall prairie grass, a river quietly flowing between ancient forests, the soft crackling of a campfire beneath countless stars, the distant call of an eagle circling high above a mountain valley. These are the sounds that welcomed generations of people long before modern America existed. Our story begins not with soldiers, nor with battlefields, but with a continent already alive, a continent filled with thriving nations, rich traditions, and countless generations of history that had been unfolding for thousands of years before the first European ships appeared upon the eastern horizon. To understand the American Indian Wars, we must first understand the extraordinary world that existed before those first encounters. And that is where our journey truly begins. Long before the first European ship appeared along the Atlantic coast, North America was already a world filled with life. It was not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered, nor was it a single nation stretching from one ocean to another. Instead, it was home to hundreds of independent native nations, each with its own history, language, traditions, and way of life. Their ancestors had lived on this continent for thousands of years, generation after generation. Families learned the rivers, forests, mountains, and plains as intimately as one might know the rooms of a familiar home. Children grew into skilled hunters, farmers, craftsmen, storytellers, and leaders. Elders passed down ancient knowledge through spoken tradition rather than written books. Every season brought its own responsibilities. Every landscape offered different opportunities. The continent itself shaped the people who called it home. Along the Atlantic coast, dense forests stretched for hundreds of miles. Towering oak, maple, chestnut, and pine trees formed a green canopy above countless rivers and streams. The people living here depended upon both farming and hunting. Fields of corn, beans, and squash surrounded carefully planned villages. These three crops became known as the Three Sisters because they grew together in ways that benefited one another. Corn provided tall stalks for beans to climb. Beans enriched the soil. Squash spread across the ground, helping retain moisture and reduce weeds. It was a remarkably effective farming system developed centuries before Europeans arrived. Villages often stood beside rivers. Wooden homes surrounded open gathering places where families met for celebrations, ceremonies, and important discussions. Fishing supplied fresh food throughout much of the year. Deer, turkey, and smaller game filled the surrounding forests. Life followed the rhythm of nature. Farther north, the forests became even denser. Cold winters blanketed the land with deep snow. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to many today as the Iroquois Confederacy, developed one of the most sophisticated political systems in North America, rather than existing as a single tribe. The Confederacy united several nations under a shared council while allowing each nation to govern its own affairs. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. Together they created a powerful alliance that promoted cooperation while reducing conflict among its member nations. Important decisions required careful discussion. Leaders often debated issues at length before reaching agreement. Consensus mattered deeply. Some historians have even noted similarities between certain aspects of the Confederacy's council system and later ideas about representative government, though the exact influence remains a subject of ongoing historical discussion. To the southeast, the land grew warmer. Broad rivers wound through fertile valleys. Here lived nations such as the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, though the Seminole people would emerge later through a blending of different groups in Florida. Many southeastern communities became highly successful farmers. Large towns flourished beside rivers. Wooden council houses stood at the center of carefully organized settlements. Trade connected neighboring nations across hundreds of miles. Shells from the Gulf Coast appeared far inland. Copper from distant regions found its way into southern villages, long before Europeans arrived. North America already possessed extensive trade networks. Travelers exchanged goods, stories, ideas, and friendships across enormous distances. Far beyond the Mississippi River, the landscape changed dramatically. The Great Plains stretched toward the western horizon. Rolling grasslands seemed almost endless beneath enormous blue skies. Before horses returned to North America with the Spanish during the 16th century, many Plains peoples traveled on foot or with the assistance of dogs pulling wooden sleds known as travois. Life required remarkable adaptability. The buffalo became central to survival. Every part of the animal served a purpose. Meat provided food. Hides became clothing, blankets, and shelter. Bones were shaped into tools. Sinew became strong thread. Nothing was wasted. After horses spread northward during the following centuries, life upon the plains transformed forever. Entire nations became among the finest horsemen in the world. But that remarkable chapter still lay in the future. Across the deserts of the Southwest, another extraordinary world flourished. The Hopi, Zuni, and many Pueblo peoples built remarkable stone and adobe communities beneath towering cliffs and broad desert skies. Some villages stood for centuries. Ingenious irrigation systems carried precious water to carefully tended fields. Despite living in one of North America's driest regions, these communities developed thriving agricultural societies. The landscape demanded patience. Every drop of rain mattered. Every harvest depended upon careful planning. Meanwhile, along the Pacific Northwest, towering cedar forests met the ocean. Salmon filled countless rivers each year during their great migrations. Communities built enormous wooden houses capable of sheltering many families. Master carvers created beautiful canoes from single cedar logs. Totem poles preserved family histories and honored important ancestors. The sea provided abundance, fishing, whaling, shellfish, trade. The ocean shaped daily life just as completely as the forest shaped those living farther east. Each region of North America encouraged different ways of living. No single lifestyle suited every environment. People adapted with remarkable creativity. They learned from experience, observed nature carefully, passed practical knowledge from one generation to the next. To many native nations, the land represented far more than property. It was home, provider, teacher. Many traditions emphasize balance between people and the natural world. Animals deserved respect. Rivers possessed deep significance. Mountains inspired spiritual reflection. Although beliefs varied greatly between nations, a close relationship with the environment remained central throughout much of the continent. Children learned these lessons from an early age. A young hunter did not simply learn how to track deer, he learned patience, observation, respect. A young girl gathering medicinal plants learned which roots healed wounds, which leaves reduced fever, which flowers should never be touched. Knowledge grew through experience rather than written instruction. Stories played an equally important role. Evenings often ended beside glowing campfires. Grandparents shared histories stretching back countless generations. Creation stories explained the origins of the world. Legends taught courage, kindness, humility, wisdom. Without written books, memory became a treasured skill. History lived within the voices of the people themselves. This peaceful world was not without conflict. Disagreements occurred. Competition over hunting grounds sometimes led to warfare. Alliances formed. Rivalries emerged. Just as in every part of the world, human societies experienced both peace and conflict. Yet these wars generally remained local. No one imagined that entirely new nations would soon arrive across the ocean. During the closing years of the 15th century, far beyond the Atlantic, European explorers searched for new routes to Asia. Advances in navigation encouraged longer voyages. Powerful kingdoms competed for trade. Ships ventured farther than ever before. Unknown coastlines slowly appeared upon newly drawn maps. The meeting of these two worlds, one shaped over thousands of years, the other driven by exploration and expanding empires, would transform both forever. The first encounters would begin with curiosity, trade, gifts, conversation. But beneath those peaceful beginnings, different ideas about land, powers, and ownership already waited quietly beneath the surface. In time, those differences would grow into some of the longest and most consequential conflicts in American history, and our journey toward those first encounters is about to begin. As the 16th century slowly gave way to the early years of the 17th, the Atlantic Ocean no longer felt quite so vast. European ships crossed its waters with increasing confidence. Spanish explorers had already established settlements far to the south. French traders ventured along great northern rivers. English merchants looked westward with growing ambition. Each kingdom sought opportunity, new trade, new land, new influence, yet none fully understood the continent waiting beyond the horizon. Nor could the native nations have imagined how profoundly these newcomers would reshape their world. In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships sailed into the broad waters of the Chesapeake Bay. After months at sea, the weary settlers searched for a place to establish England's first permanent colony in North America. Eventually, they chose a small peninsula beside the James River. They named it Jamestown. At first glance, the location appeared promising. The deep river allowed ships to anchor close to shore. The surrounding forests offered timber. The water provided a route back to the Atlantic. Yet the settlers had unknowingly chosen difficult ground. The nearby marshes bred mosquitoes. Fresh drinking water often became contaminated. The summers proved hot and humid. Disease spread quickly. Food soon became scarce. Many of the colonists had arrived expecting wealth rather than hard physical labor. Few possessed experience farming unfamiliar land. Within months, the settlement struggled simply to survive. Yet Jamestown was not alone. Long before the English arrived, this region had already belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy, led by the powerful chief Seneca, known to history simply as Powhatan. The Confederacy united more than 30 Algonquian-speaking communities across present-day Virginia. Thousands of people lived throughout the region. Villages stood beside rivers. Fields of corn stretched across fertile clearings. Fishing, hunting, and trade supported daily life. The arrival of strange wooden ships naturally attracted attention. At first, curiosity often outweighed fear. The English brought unfamiliar objects, metal tools, glass beads, copper kettles, firearms. The Powhatan people possessed valuable knowledge of the land. They understood its seasons, its rivers, its forests, its hidden dangers. Trade began cautiously. Corn and food exchanged hands. The English offered manufactured goods from Europe. Both sides hoped cooperation might benefit everyone. For a brief time, peace seemed possible. One of the most famous stories from this early period involves Captain John Smith and Pocahontas. According to Smith's later writings, he was captured during an expedition and brought before Chief Powhatan. Smith claimed that Pocahontas, one of Powhatan's daughters, intervened to save his life. Historians continue debating exactly what occurred. Some believe Smith misunderstood an adoption ceremony. Others question whether the event happened exactly as later described. What remains clear is that Pocahontas became an important figure during the colony's early years. As a young girl, she frequently visited Jamestown carrying food and messages. Her presence helped maintain peaceful communication between the two communities during difficult times. Unfortunately, good intentions could not solve deeper problems. The English settlement continued growing. Every new arrival required more land, more timber, more farmland. To the colonists, unused forests often appeared available for expansion. To the Powhatan people, those same forests provided hunting grounds, sacred places, travel routes, resources carefully managed for generations. The two societies viewed land very differently. For many native communities, land belonged to the people collectively. Families used particular areas, but ownership rarely followed European ideas of permanent private property. The English brought different customs. They marked boundaries, claimed fields, built fences, recorded ownership on paper. Neither side fully understood the other's perspective. Small misunderstandings gradually became larger disagreements. Food shortages further strained relations. During the harsh winter of 1609 and 1610, Jamestown entered what later became known as the Starving Time. The situation grew desperate. Disease spread rapidly. Many settlers died. Historical accounts describe terrible suffering within the settlement. The English increasingly depended upon supplies from nearby native villages. The Powhatan people naturally hesitated to provide unlimited food for an expanding colony whose long-term intentions remained uncertain. Trust slowly faded. Raids and reprisals began occurring. Neither side desired endless conflict, yet fear often encouraged violence before peaceful solutions could be found. Years passed. Jamestown slowly recovered. New settlers continued arriving from England. Tobacco farming transformed the colony's economy. Large plantations expanded along the rivers. Prosperity encouraged further growth. Growth demanded additional land. The pressure upon native communities steadily increased. Chief Powhatan grew older. Leadership gradually passed toward his brother, Opachanchano. Unlike earlier years of cautious cooperation, Opachanchano increasingly believed that English expansion threatened the future of his people. His concerns proved understandable. Every passing year brought more colonists, more farms, more permanent settlements. The balance of power slowly shifted. Then, in 1614, a remarkable event briefly raised hopes for lasting peace. Pocahontas married the English settler John Rolfe. The marriage created several years of relative stability between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy. Pocahontas later traveled to England, where many viewed her as a symbol of friendship between two worlds. Sadly, she became ill and died in 1617 before returning home. She was only about 21 years old. Her story continues to fascinate historians today. Yet her death also symbolized the fragile nature of the peace she had helped encourage. By the early 1620s, the English population had expanded dramatically. New farms covered increasing portions of Virginia. Native leaders watched familiar forests disappear. Game animals retreated farther inland. Ancient travel routes crossed newly claimed fields. For Opachanchano, the time for waiting had ended. On the morning of March 22nd, 1622, coordinated attacks struck numerous English settlements throughout Virginia. The surprise was devastating. Hundreds of colonists lost their lives during what became known as the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. Some settlements were abandoned, others barely survived. Jamestown itself escaped destruction after receiving a last-minute warning. The attacks shocked the English colonies just as deeply. They transformed the attitudes on both sides. Years of cautious coexistence gave way to deep suspicion. Retaliation followed. English forces launched repeated military campaigns. Native villages were attacked, fields destroyed. Peace became increasingly difficult to restore. Although periods of negotiation continued, the relationship between settlers and native nations had changed forever. The conflicts in Virginia became one of the earliest chapters in what historians now call the American Indian Wars. They revealed a pattern that would appear again and again across the continent. Different cultures meeting with hope, finding opportunities for cooperation, then gradually facing conflict as populations grew, resources became contested, and trust slowly disappeared. The forests of Virginia still stood tall. The rivers continued flowing quietly toward the Atlantic, but beneath their peaceful beauty, a new chapter of American history had begun. And farther north, another conflict, even larger and more devastating, was slowly approaching. Its leader would become known to the English as King Philip. His people knew him by another name, Metacom. By the middle of the 17th century, the forests of New England had changed. When the first English settlers arrived decades earlier, the coastline had seemed almost endless. Towering pine trees stretched from the rocky shores far into the interior. Clear rivers flowed toward the Atlantic. Native villages and English towns remained separated by great distances. For a time, both worlds had managed to exist beside one another. But every passing year brought more ships from Europe. More families crossed the Atlantic seeking new opportunities. New farms appeared where forests had once stood. Wooden fences divided fields. Church steeples rose above growing towns. Roads slowly connected settlements that had once been isolated. The English population expanded rapidly. For many native nations, the transformation happened within a single lifetime. Land that had provided hunting grounds for generations gradually disappeared beneath fields of wheat, corn, and grazing livestock. Ancient trails became wagon roads. Streams once used for fishing now powered colonial mills. The pace of change felt relentless. Among the native peoples most affected were the Wampanoag. Their homeland stretched across much of present-day southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, only a generation earlier. Their leader, Massasoit, had formed an important alliance with the Plymouth colony. That agreement helped both communities survive difficult years. The famous harvest celebration, remembered today as the first Thanksgiving, reflected one brief moment of cooperation between two very different worlds. Massasoit believed peaceful relations offered the best chance for his people. For many years, that hope endured. Trade flourished. Diplomatic meetings continued. Both sides generally respected the agreement, but peace often depends upon the people who maintain it. When Massasoit grew older, leadership eventually passed to his sons. First Wamsuta, known to many English settlers as Alexander. Then, after Wamsuta's sudden death in 1662, leadership passed to his younger brother, Metacom. The English called him King Philip. Metacom inherited a world very different from the one his father had known. The English settlements had multiplied. Colonial governments grew increasingly powerful. More land was claimed each year. Many native communities found themselves surrounded by expanding towns. At first, Metacom attempted diplomacy. Like his father before him, he understood the value of peace. Meetings took place between native leaders and colonial officials. Promises were exchanged, treaties signed, yet suspicion slowly increased on both sides. Colonial authorities worried about possible native alliances. Native leaders watched their territory steadily shrink. Neither side fully trusted the other. Small disagreements over land ownership became larger disputes. Livestock wandered into native cornfields. Colonists accused native hunters of theft. Native communities protested unfair trade practices. Each disagreement added another layer of misunderstanding. One event especially deepened tensions. In early 1675, a native man named John Sassamon was found dead beneath the ice of a frozen pond. Sassamon had worked as an interpreter between native communities and the English. He had also warned colonial authorities that Metacom might be preparing for conflict. Several Wampanoag men were accused of his murder. The colonial court tried and executed them. Many native people believed the English had overstepped their authority. The trial became another symbol of growing resentment. By the summer of 1675, the fragile peace finally collapsed. Fighting began near the town of Swansea. Small attacks quickly spread across the region. Within weeks, settlements throughout New England found themselves caught in a conflict unlike anything they had previously experienced. King Philip's War had begun for both sides. The fighting proved extraordinarily difficult. The landscape itself shaped every battle. Dense forests limited visibility. Marshes slowed movement. Rocky hills offered natural defensive positions. Large European-style armies rarely fought in open fields. Instead, small groups moved quietly through the wilderness. Ambushes became common. Villages were attacked without warning. Night offered little safety. Colonial militias struggled to adapt. Many soldiers had trained for traditional European warfare. The forest demanded different skills. Native warriors knew the land intimately. They moved swiftly between trees, crossed rivers with remarkable speed, disappeared into the wilderness before larger forces could respond. Their understanding of the terrain became one of their greatest advantages. Yet the colonies possessed strengths of their own. They could raise additional militia from neighboring towns. Ships carried supplies along the coastline. Settlements communicated with increasing efficiency. As the months passed, the conflict expanded. Native nations faced difficult choices. Some joined Metacom, others remained neutral. Several allied themselves with the English. The war did not divide people simply by culture. Old rivalries between native nations also influenced decisions. History is often more complicated than simple alliances. One of the most devastating moments came during the winter of 1675. Colonial forces launched an attack against a fortified Narragansett village in what became known as the Great Swamp Fight. The battle took place during freezing weather. Snow covered the ground. The village stood protected within a swamp surrounded by wooden defenses. After fierce fighting, the settlement was destroyed. Many people lost their lives. The event greatly intensified the conflict. As winter slowly gave way to spring, violence continued spreading across New England. Dozens of towns suffered attacks. Some were abandoned completely. Families sought safety behind stronger defenses. Fields went unplanted. Trade nearly stopped. Fear became part of everyday life. Travel between settlements required armed escorts. The uncertainty affected everyone. For native communities, the hardship proved equally severe. Food became increasingly scarce. Traditional villages could no longer remain in one place for long. Families moved constantly to avoid colonial patrols. Winters grew harder. Disease spread through communities already weakened by years of conflict. The war exhausted both sides. Despite his determination, Metacom gradually found himself facing overwhelming odds. More colonial soldiers entered the field. Native allies of the English provided valuable knowledge of the forests. One by one, many of Metacom's supporters were defeated or captured. By the summer of 1676, the conflict approached its final chapter. Metacom continued moving through the forests with a small group of loyal followers. He knew the land well, yet opportunities for escape grew fewer each week. On August 12, 1676, colonial forces assisted by native allies surrounded his camp near Mount Hope. During the fighting, Metacom was killed. His death effectively ended King Philip's War. The conflict remains one of the deadliest wars, proportionally, in early American history. Entire towns had been destroyed. Thousands of lives had been lost. Communities on every side carried lasting memories of hardship. For the English colonies, victory brought greater control over southern New England. For many native nations, the consequences proved devastating. Some communities dispersed. Others moved farther inland. Ancient alliances changed forever. Yet the American Indian Wars were far from over. As English settlements continued expanding, new frontiers emerged. Farther north, French traders traveled deep into the Great Lakes. Native nations formed new alliances. European empires prepared for larger struggles across North America. The next great chapter would no longer involve only native nations and English colonies. Soon, Britain and France would compete for control of an entire continent, and native peoples would once again find themselves at the very center of history. As the smoke of King Philip's War slowly drifted away, a different struggle was quietly unfolding farther north. The forests surrounding the Great Lakes, the broad valleys of the Ohio country, and the mighty St. Lawrence River had become the meeting place of two great European empires, Britain and France. Unlike the English colonies along the Atlantic coast, New France remained lightly populated. French settlements were fewer in number, most clustered beside rivers that served as natural highways through the wilderness. Instead of building large farming communities, many French settlers focused upon trade, especially the fur trade. Beaver pelts had become one of Europe's most valuable commodities. Fashionable hats made from beaver felt were highly prized throughout France and Britain. To satisfy growing demand, French traders journeyed deep into North America. They traveled in canoes along winding rivers, crossed countless lakes, established trading posts far beyond the edge of European settlement. These men became known as voyageurs. Their lives depended upon cooperation with native nations. Without experienced native guides, few Europeans could have navigated the enormous wilderness. Over time, strong relationships developed between French traders and many native communities. Trade brought metal tools, firearms, blankets, glass beads, and other European goods. In return, native hunters supplied valuable furs gathered throughout the forests. The partnerships often extended beyond business. Friendships formed. Some French traders married into native communities. They learned local languages, adapted to wilderness travel. Many lived much of their lives far from the cities of Europe. Meanwhile, the British colonies along the Atlantic coast continued expanding westward. Every new settlement required farmland. Every growing town demanded timber. Roads slowly pushed toward the Appalachian Mountains. Beyond those mountains lay the Ohio country, a vast region of fertile forests, rivers, and rich hunting grounds. To many native nations, the Ohio Valley served as shared territory. Numerous peoples traveled, hunted, and traded throughout the region. The Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Ottawa, Wyandotte, and many others all maintained important connections to this remarkable landscape. Both Britain and France claimed ownership of the Ohio country. Neither intended to surrender it. By the early 1750s, tension steadily increased. French soldiers constructed a chain of forts connecting Canada with the Mississippi River. These forts protected trade routes while strengthening French claims to the interior. British colonial leaders viewed the growing network with concern. They feared being permanently blocked from Western expansion. Small confrontations soon followed. Among the young officers sent westward by Virginia was a 22-year-old surveyor named George Washington. Long before becoming the first president of the United States, Washington found himself exploring forests few Europeans had ever seen. In 1754, his small force clashed with French soldiers in the Ohio Valley. Although the encounter itself remained limited, it helped ignite a much larger conflict. The French and Indian War had begun. Despite its name, the conflict involved far more than France and native nations. Britain and France became the principal European rivals. Many native peoples chose alliances based upon their own interests rather than loyalty to either empire. Some believed French expansion posed the smaller threat. Others favored British trade. Still others attempted to remain neutral whenever possible. Every nation carefully considered its own future. This was never simply a European war fought upon American soil. Native leaders played essential roles throughout the conflict. One of the most respected among them was Pontiac, an Ottawa leader known for his intelligence and diplomatic skill. Although Pontiac would become even more famous after the war, he and many other native leaders closely observed how the balance of power might change. The forests of North America once again became battlefields. Unlike the open plains of Europe, dense woods favored smaller groups of experienced fighters. Soldiers marched along narrow trails. Forts guarded important rivers. Canoes often transported supplies more efficiently than wagons. Ambushes remained common. Knowledge of the landscape frequently proved more valuable than superior numbers. Perhaps no battle better demonstrated these realities than the defeat of General Edward Braddock in 1755. Braddock commanded a large British army advancing toward Fort Duquesne, located where the city of Pittsburgh stands today. Confident in traditional European military tactics, his soldiers marched in disciplined columns through the forest. Bright red uniforms flashed beneath the trees. Drums echoed through the wilderness to experienced native warriors. The formation presented an obvious target. French soldiers and their native allies launched a sudden attack from concealed positions. The forest itself seemed to come alive. Gunfire echoed from behind trees. Smoke drifted through the woods. The British struggled to identify their attackers. Conventional battlefield formations quickly dissolved into confusion. General Braddock received fatal wounds during the battle. Young George Washington helped organize the retreat, earning widespread respect for his calm leadership under extraordinary pressure. The defeat shocked Britain. It also demonstrated that European armies could not simply apply Old World tactics to the North American wilderness. As the war continued, both sides gradually adapted. British soldiers learned woodland fighting techniques. Native scouts became indispensable. French commanders relied heavily upon alliances with native nations. Forts rose beside rivers throughout the continent. Each controlled valuable transportation routes. Each represented influence over the surrounding wilderness. One of the most famous fortresses stood beside Lake Ontario, Fort Frontenac. Others guarded the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Ohio Valley. Together they formed an enormous network stretching across much of North America. Far to the north, another dramatic struggle unfolded. The fortress of Louisbourg guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Its massive stone walls overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. After a difficult siege, British forces captured the fortress in 1758. The victory opened the way toward the heart of New France. The following year, British General James Wolfe and French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm met outside Quebec. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham lasted only a short time, yet its consequences proved enormous. Both commanders suffered fatal wounds. The British captured Quebec. Soon afterward, French resistance gradually weakened. By 1763, the war had ended. Under the Treaty of Paris, France surrendered nearly all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. For Britain, the victory appeared complete. For many native nations, the outcome created new uncertainty. The French, despite their smaller settlements, had generally emphasized trade relationships. British officials often approached Western territories differently. New policies reduced diplomatic gift-giving. Military commanders sometimes treated native leaders with less respect than their French predecessors had shown. Misunderstandings quickly multiplied. Many native communities feared that British settlers would soon flood into the Ohio Valley just as English colonists had expanded across New England and Virginia. Among those watching these changes carefully, one leader began calling for unity. His name was Pontiac. Within months, the forests surrounding the Great Lakes would once again erupt into conflict. This time, the war would no longer be between Britain and France. Instead, it would become one of the most remarkable native resistance movements in North American history. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, officially ended the French and Indian War. Across Europe, kings celebrated victory. Diplomats signed agreements. Maps were redrawn. Yet thousands of miles away, deep within the forests of North America, the future remained uncertain. For many native nations, the war had not truly ended. It had simply entered a new chapter. For nearly a century, France and Britain had competed for influence across the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. Native leaders had carefully balanced relationships with both empires. Neither European power had ever completely dominated the interior. Now, everything had changed. France had largely disappeared from North America. Britain stood alone as the dominant European power east of the Mississippi River. Many native communities watched these developments with growing concern. French traders had often lived among native villages. They exchanged gifts during diplomatic meetings. Military officers understood that alliances required mutual respect. British officials viewed the frontier somewhat differently. General Geoffrey Amherst, the commander of British forces in North America, believed many of the expensive diplomatic traditions established by the French were unnecessary. The annual exchange of gifts with native leaders was greatly reduced. Trade became more restricted. Even the sale of gunpowder and ammunition was limited. To British officials, these changes appeared practical. To many native nations, they signaled something far more troubling. Respect seemed to be disappearing. Misunderstandings quickly multiplied. Throughout the Great Lakes region, native leaders gathered in councils to discuss the changing world around them. Many feared that British settlers would soon flood westward into lands that had long remained beyond colonial expansion. The forests, the rivers, the hunting grounds. Everything seemed uncertain. Among the leaders who spoke most passionately during these gatherings was an Ottawa chief named Pontiac. Pontiac had earned widespread respect through years of diplomacy and leadership. Although historians continue debating the exact extent of his authority over other nations, there is little doubt that his influence reached far beyond his own community. He understood that no single nation could successfully resist Britain alone. Only cooperation offered hope. At about the same time, a Delaware spiritual leader known as Neolin shared a powerful message. Sometimes called the Delaware Prophet, Neolin encouraged native peoples to return to traditional ways of life. He urged them to reject dependence upon European goods, to preserve their customs, their beliefs, and their connection to the land. His message spread quickly across many communities. For some, it became a source of renewed purpose. Pontiac combined diplomacy with careful planning. Throughout the winter of 1762 and into the spring of 1763, messengers traveled quietly between villages. Meetings took place beside rivers and campfires. Plans slowly formed. The goal was ambitious: capture British forts throughout the Great Lakes before reinforcements could arrive. If successful, the British frontier might collapse. On May 7, 1763, Pontiac and several hundred warriors approached Fort Detroit. The fort stood beside the narrow river connecting Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. British soldiers watched the visitors with curiosity. Meetings between native leaders and military commanders were common. Pontiac requested a council. Hidden beneath blankets carried by some of his followers were weapons intended for a surprise attack. According to tradition, a signal would begin the assault once everyone entered the fort. But the plan never unfolded. British officers had somehow learned of the intended attack. The gates remained heavily guarded. Soldiers stood ready, realizing surprise had been lost. Pontiac withdrew peacefully. If Fort Detroit could not be captured quickly, it would have to be besieged. Thus began one of the longest and most remarkable sieges in early American history. For months, Pontiac's warriors surrounded the fort. British supply lines became increasingly difficult to maintain. Small boats attempting to reach Detroit risked ambush. Messengers traveled cautiously through the surrounding forests. Life inside the fort grew tense. Outside, the native warriors demonstrated remarkable patience. Rather than launching repeated costly assaults against strong walls, they waited, watched, controlled much of the surrounding countryside. Detroit became only one part of a much larger movement. Across the Great Lakes, native warriors attacked British forts almost simultaneously. Fort Sandusky fell, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, Fort Powhatan, Fort Michilimackinac, one after another. Several isolated British outposts were captured. The fall of Fort Michilimackinac became especially famous. Located beside the narrow straits connecting Lakes Huron and Michigan, the fort appeared secure. On June 2nd, native players organized what seemed to be a friendly game of stickball outside the walls. British soldiers relaxed as they watched the contest. Suddenly, the ball flew toward the open gate. Players rushed after it. Hidden weapons were quickly retrieved from nearby blankets. Within moments, the game transformed into a carefully planned surprise attack. The fort was captured. Stories like these spread rapidly across the frontier. Many British settlements suddenly found themselves isolated. Travel became dangerous. Supply routes disappeared. Panic spread through distant communities. The British responded by organizing relief expeditions. One of the most important occurred near present-day Pittsburgh. Fort Pitt remained under siege, as native warriors controlled much of the surrounding region. Colonel Henry Bouquet assembled a force to relieve the isolated garrison. Marching west through dense forests, his soldiers approached a narrow area later known as Bushy Run. On August 5, 1763, native warriors launched a determined attack. The fighting lasted 2 difficult days. Bouquet carefully adapted his tactics to the woodland environment. Rather than relying upon rigid European formations, he used controlled withdrawals and coordinated counterattacks. Eventually, the British reached Fort Pitt. The siege ended. Elsewhere, the conflict continued. Although Pontiac's movement achieved remarkable early success, capturing large forts remained extraordinarily difficult without heavy artillery. The British Empire also possessed significant advantages. Additional soldiers crossed the Atlantic. Supplies arrived by ship. Gradually, the balance began shifting. Yet Britain also recognized an important truth. Military victory alone would not restore lasting peace. Diplomacy remained essential. Late in 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation. The document established a boundary roughly following the Appalachian Mountains. British settlers were forbidden from moving west beyond this line without official permission. The government hoped this measure would reduce conflict between settlers and native nations. Many native leaders cautiously welcomed the announcement. Many colonists, however, reacted very differently. They believed Britain was denying them access to lands they had helped defend during the recent war. The proclamation would become one of several growing disagreements between Britain and its American colonies. Meanwhile, Pontiac gradually entered peace negotiations. The conflict slowly faded over the following years. Although historians today often refer to these events as Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War, its legacy reached far beyond one leader. It demonstrated that native nations could organize resistance across enormous distances. It reminded Britain that diplomacy remained just as important as military strength, and it revealed that the frontier would remain a place of constant negotiation rather than permanent conquest. As the forest slowly grew quiet once again, another generation was already coming of age. Children born during Pontiac's War would soon witness an entirely different revolution, not between native nations and European empires, but between Britain and its own American colonies. The struggle for North America was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The American Revolution ended in 1783. Across the 13 former colonies, church bells rang in celebration. Crowds gathered in town squares. The United States had won its independence. A new nation had been born. But far beyond the Atlantic coast, across the forests of the Ohio Valley, the rolling hills of Kentucky, and the vast lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the future remained uncertain. For many native nations, nothing had truly been settled. Throughout the Revolutionary War, numerous native communities had faced an impossible choice. Some allied themselves with Britain, others supported the American colonies. Many tried to remain neutral. Every decision carried enormous risks. Most native leaders were not fighting for the British Crown or the Continental Congress. They were fighting for something much closer to home: their own land, their own people, their own future. When Britain signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, it officially transferred an enormous amount of territory to the newly formed United States. On European maps, the borders appeared simple. Lines stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. But those lands were not empty. Hundreds of native villages already existed throughout the region. The treaty had been negotiated without native representatives. Many leaders were stunned to discover that lands they had lived upon for countless generations had been exchanged by distant governments without their knowledge or consent. Not surprisingly, many native nations refused to recognize the agreement. The forests beyond the Ohio River remained their homeland. No treaty signed across the ocean could change that. Meanwhile, thousands of American settlers looked westward with excitement. The Revolutionary War had ended. New opportunities awaited. Families loaded wagons with furniture, tools, seeds, and livestock. Long wagon trains slowly crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Kentucky attracted growing numbers of settlers. New cabins appeared beside rivers. Fresh fields replaced stretches of untouched forest. Once again, expansion created new tensions. Native hunting grounds gradually disappeared. Ancient trails became roads. Small settlements steadily grew into frontier towns. Many native leaders realized that isolated resistance would accomplish little. The challenges now facing them resembled those confronted during Pontiac's War. Unity offered the greatest hope. Throughout the Ohio country, several nations began cooperating more closely. The Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and others formed a powerful defensive alliance historians now call the Western Confederacy. Their goal was straightforward: prevent further American settlement north of the Ohio River. The young United States government also hoped to avoid another prolonged war. Diplomatic meetings took place, treaties were proposed, promises were exchanged. Yet both sides held fundamentally different expectations. American officials generally believed native nations should surrender territory through formal agreements. Native leaders argued that much of the land simply could not be sold in the manner Europeans imagined. The discussions often ended without lasting solutions. By the late 1780s, violence gradually increased. Small frontier settlements occasionally suffered attacks. Militia patrols responded. Fear spread throughout the region. Many families slept with muskets close beside their beds. Travel between isolated communities became increasingly dangerous. The United States government recognized that a stronger military response seemed inevitable. In 1790, President George Washington ordered General Josiah Harmar to lead an expedition into the Northwest Territory. The objective was to discourage further resistance and establish greater American authority. The campaign did not unfold as planned. Native warriors avoided direct confrontation until favorable opportunities appeared. Small ambushes disrupted the American advance. Supplies became difficult to protect. Eventually, Harmar withdrew after suffering significant losses. The following year, another expedition was organized, this time under General Arthur St. Clair. Nearly 1,400 soldiers and militia marched north through the forests. It became one of the largest military operations yet attempted by the young United States. Unfortunately, preparation proved inadequate. Many soldiers lacked experience. Supplies remained inconsistent. Discipline varied considerably. Native scouts observed the Army's progress carefully. Among the most respected leaders within the Western Confederacy were Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee. Both possessed extraordinary knowledge of the region. They understood the forests, the rivers, the terrain, and the tactics best suited for woodland warfare. On the morning of November 4th, 1791, near the headwaters of the Wabash River, the Confederacy launched a carefully coordinated attack. The American camp had only begun preparing breakfast. Many soldiers were still organizing for the day. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the surrounding forest. Warriors advanced rapidly from several directions. The surprise proved devastating. General St. Clair attempted repeatedly to organize defensive lines, yet the attacks continued from every side. Smoke drifted through the trees. Communication became increasingly difficult. Within hours, the American army collapsed. The survivors retreated southward in disorder. The Battle of the Wabash, often called St. Clair's defeat, remains the greatest military defeat ever suffered by the United States Army in conflicts against Native nations. News reached Philadelphia with astonishing speed. President Washington reportedly reacted with visible frustration. The young republic faced an uncomfortable truth. Its frontier could not be secured so easily. Yet Washington also understood another important lesson. The nation required a better trained military. Rather than relying largely upon temporary militia, he supported the creation of a permanent professional force. General Anthony Wayne received command. Known for his strict discipline, Wayne spent nearly 2 years preparing his soldiers. Training became constant. Marksmanship improved. Marching formations were refined. Supply systems strengthened. Unlike previous expeditions, Wayne refused to rush. His patience frustrated some politicians, but it greatly increased the Army's readiness. The new force became known as the Legion of the United States. Meanwhile, the Western Confederacy also prepared. Its leaders recognized that another American campaign would eventually come. Yet maintaining unity among numerous independent nations remained challenging. Some favored continued resistance. Others wondered whether negotiation might now offer a better future. As always, history presented no easy choices. By the summer of 1794, Wayne's army advanced northward once again. This time, the soldiers moved carefully, well supplied, highly disciplined, near the Maumee River. The two sides finally met. The battlefield contained hundreds of fallen trees left behind by a recent storm. Branches and trunks covered the ground in every direction. The place soon became known as Fallen Timbers. On August 20th, the battle began. Native warriors fought skillfully among the tangled forest, but Wayne's soldiers maintained their formations. The disciplined advance gradually pushed forward. After fierce fighting, the Confederacy withdrew. Many warriors hoped nearby British forces stationed at Fort Miami would offer assistance. Instead, the gates remained closed. Britain, seeking to avoid another war with the United States, chose not to intervene directly. For many Native leaders, the decision marked a profound disappointment. The following year, U.S. representatives gathered to negotiate peace. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville was signed. Several Native nations agreed to cede large portions of present-day Ohio while recognizing a new boundary between Native territory and American settlements. In return, The United States promised annual payments and recognized certain remaining native lands. For a brief time, peace returned to much of the Northwest Territory. Yet many younger native leaders remained deeply troubled. They believed the steady loss of land would never truly end. Among those carefully watching these events was a young Shawnee warrior. His name was Tecumseh. In the years ahead, he would attempt something even more ambitious than Pontiac or the Western Confederacy had achieved. He dreamed of uniting native nations across the entire frontier, and his vision would become one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the American Indian Wars. As the 19th century dawned, the young United States looked toward the western horizon with growing confidence. New towns appeared almost every year. Roads stretched deeper into the frontier. Families crossed rivers that only a generation earlier had marked the edge of American settlement. To many settlers, the West represented opportunity, fresh farmland, new beginnings, a better future. But for the native nations who already called those lands home, the same movement looked very different. Every new cabin meant another clearing in the forest. Every new road crossed ancient hunting grounds. Every new treaty seemed to reduce the land that remained. Among those watching these changes with increasing concern was a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh. Born around 1768 in the Ohio country, Tecumseh had grown up during years of constant conflict. As a boy, he witnessed villages destroyed by war. He saw families forced to abandon homes that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. He watched one treaty after another transfer native lands into American hands. Unlike many leaders of his time, Tecumseh believed the problem extended far beyond any single nation. No individual tribe, no matter how brave, could stop American expansion alone. Only unity offered hope. He spent years traveling across the frontier. His journeys carried him hundreds of miles through forest, across rivers, and over broad prairies. Wherever he traveled, he spoke with native leaders, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Ojibwe, the Creek, the Choctaw, even distant nations beyond the Mississippi. His message remained remarkably consistent. The land belongs to all native peoples together. No single nation has the right to sell it. If we stand divided, we will lose everything. Many admired Tecumseh. He possessed natural charisma. He spoke calmly, confidently, without unnecessary anger. Even American officials who later met him acknowledged his remarkable presence. One observer described him as a leader who inspired respect simply by entering a room. Yet Tecumseh did not work alone. His younger brother, Tenskwatawa, played an equally important role. Earlier in life, Tenskwatawa had struggled to find his place. Then, around 1805, he experienced a profound religious awakening, soon known as the Prophet. He preached that native peoples should reject many European influences. He encouraged a return to traditional beliefs, traditional clothing, traditional customs. He argued that dependence upon American trade had weakened native communities. His teachings spread rapidly. Villages across the frontier listened carefully. Many believed his message offered both spiritual renewal and political hope. Together, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa founded a new settlement along the Tippecanoe River in present-day Indiana. It became known as Prophetstown. The village quickly grew. Families from many different native nations arrived. Unlike most settlements, Prophetstown welcomed people regardless of tribal background. Shawnee lived beside Potawatomi, Kickapoo beside Winnebago, Delaware beside Ottawa. For perhaps the first time, Tecumseh's dream of unity began taking visible form. American officials watched these developments with growing concern. One man especially followed events closely: William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory. Harrison believed continued settlement depended upon acquiring additional native land. In 1809, he negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne. Several native leaders agreed to sell nearly 3 million acres of land. Tecumseh reacted immediately. He argued that those leaders possessed no authority to sell land belonging collectively to all native nations. When Tecumseh later met Harrison face to face, the meeting became tense. The two men stood only a short distance apart. Each remained calm. Each spoke firmly. Tecumseh insisted the treaty was invalid. Harrison refused to withdraw it. According to several accounts, the discussion nearly erupted into violence before both sides restored order. Although the meeting ended peacefully, neither leader changed his position. Tecumseh understood that diplomacy alone would no longer be enough. He continued traveling across the South, seeking support among the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Cherokee. While he journeyed, events at Prophetstown moved toward crisis. Governor Harrison believed Tecumseh's absence offered an opportunity. In the autumn of 1811, he assembled approximately 1,000 soldiers and militia. Their destination was Prophetstown. Harrison later explained that he wished to demonstrate American strength while discouraging future resistance. The army advanced carefully through Indiana's forests. On November 6th, they camped only a short distance from Prophetstown. The atmosphere remained tense. Negotiations were discussed. Neither side fully trusted the other. Before sunrise the following morning, warriors loyal to Tenskwatawa launched a surprise attack against Harrison's camp. Exactly why the attack began remains debated by historians. Some believe Tenskwatawa hoped to catch the Americans unprepared. Others suggest the situation simply collapsed under growing tension. Whatever the cause, the Battle of Tippecanoe had begun. The darkness added confusion. Gunfire echoed through the trees. Soldiers hurried to defensive positions. Officers shouted orders barely audible above the noise. The fighting continued for several hours. Eventually, the American line held. As daylight spread across the forest, the native warriors gradually withdrew. Harrison's army entered Prophetstown. The settlement was abandoned. Buildings were burned, food stores destroyed. The loss deeply affected Tecumseh's growing Confederacy. Although many Americans celebrated Tippecanoe as an important victory, the larger conflict had not ended. In fact, it was expanding. Across the Atlantic, Britain and the United States moved steadily toward another war. Many American leaders suspected British officials in Canada were encouraging native resistance along the frontier. Evidence suggests that British traders and military officers had indeed maintained relationships with several native nations, providing limited support and supplies. For Tecumseh, the approaching conflict presented both danger and opportunity. If Britain and the United States fought once again, perhaps a strong native alliance could secure an independent homeland between the two powers. When the War of 1812 began, Tecumseh made his choice. He allied his Confederacy with Britain, not because he wished to defend the British Empire, but because he believed it offered the best remaining chance to preserve native lands. Over the next year, Tecumseh's leadership would become legendary. American soldiers would come to respect him. British officers would praise his courage. Even his enemies would remember him as one of the greatest military leaders ever to emerge from North America. The forests along the Great Lakes, the shores of Lake Erie, and the rivers of Canada would soon become the stage for his final campaign. one that would change the future of the American frontier forever. By the summer of 1812, war had once again returned to North America. The United States declared war against Britain on June 18th, beginning what would become known as the War of 1812. For many Americans, the conflict centered on trade, maritime rights, and British interference upon the seas. But along the frontier, the war carried a different meaning. For many native nations, it represented perhaps the final opportunity to preserve their homelands. And standing at the center of that hope was Tecumseh. Unlike many military leaders of his era, Tecumseh understood that courage alone would never be enough. Victory required cooperation. His alliance with the British was based not upon loyalty to a distant king, but upon shared interests. If Britain defeated the United States, perhaps an independent native territory could be created between Canada and the expanding American frontier. It was an ambitious vision, one unlike anything previously attempted. British officers quickly recognized Tecumseh's extraordinary abilities. Major General Isaac Brock, commander of British forces in Upper Canada, admired the Shawnee leader almost immediately. The two men developed a relationship built upon mutual respect. Brock valued Tecumseh not simply as an ally, but as an equal partner. Together, they planned one of the most remarkable campaigns of the war. Their first great objective was Detroit. At the time, Detroit remained a small frontier town protected by Fort Detroit. Its commander, American General William Hull, possessed more soldiers than Brock. Yet Hull faced uncertainty, supply shortages, communication difficulties, and constant concern about Tecumseh's growing Confederacy. Brock recognized an opportunity. In August 1812, British regulars, Canadian militia, and Tecumseh's native warriors crossed the Detroit River. The force itself was relatively modest, but appearances can shape history just as much as numbers. Tecumseh cleverly marched his warriors repeatedly through openings in the forest where American observers could see them. From a distance, it appeared that endless waves of native fighters continued arriving. Meanwhile, British artillery bombarded the fort. General Hull found himself facing what he believed to be overwhelming numbers. He also feared that if fighting continued inside Detroit, civilians might suffer greatly. On August 16th, Hull surrendered the fort without a major battle. The victory stunned the United States. Detroit, an entire American fort and army, had fallen. For Britain and its native allies, the success greatly strengthened morale. Tecumseh became famous throughout North America. Stories of his leadership spread rapidly. Even many American officers acknowledged his remarkable intelligence and discipline. Unlike the stereotypes often repeated during earlier frontier conflicts, Tecumseh consistently encouraged restraint. He opposed unnecessary violence. Following the surrender at Detroit, he reportedly helped prevent harm to prisoners. His actions earned admiration from both allies and enemies. Sadly, the triumph proved temporary. Only a few months later, the course of the war changed dramatically. On October 13, 1812, General Isaac Brock led British forces during the Battle of Queenston Heights. While encouraging his soldiers, Brock was struck and killed. His death deeply affected the entire British army. For Tecumseh, it meant the loss of a trusted friend and one of the strongest supporters of his dream for an independent native homeland. The new British commanders possessed different priorities. Some remained committed to the alliance. Others focused primarily upon defending Canada. Tecumseh continued fighting with determination, yet he increasingly sensed that native interests no longer received the same attention they had under Brock. Meanwhile, the war expanded. Battles took place across the Great Lakes, along the Niagara frontier, on the Atlantic coast, and far into the southern United States. The outcome remained uncertain. Then, in September 1813, everything changed. On Lake Erie, American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry won a decisive naval victory against the British fleet. Control of the lake shifted immediately. Without naval support, British supply lines became dangerously exposed. The British Army could no longer safely remain in Detroit. A retreat became unavoidable. Tecumseh strongly opposed abandoning the territory. He argued that continued withdrawal would only encourage further American expansion. But British Commander General Henry Proctor believed he had little choice. Reluctantly, Tecumseh and his warriors joined the retreat into Upper Canada. The journey proved exhausting. Rain turned roads into thick mud. Supply wagons struggled forward. Food became increasingly scarce. American General William Henry Harrison pursued closely behind with a growing army. Every passing day narrowed the distance between the two forces. Eventually, near the Thames River in present-day Ontario, the British decided to make a stand. On October 5, 1813, the Battle of the Thames began. The British regulars occupied one portion of the battlefield. Tecumseh's warriors positioned themselves within nearby woodland. The autumn forest glowed with shades of red, orange, and gold. Fallen leaves covered the ground. Morning mist drifted between the trees. For a brief moment, the landscape appeared almost peaceful. Then, the fighting began. The American cavalry charged rapidly against the British lines. The British formation broke surprisingly quickly. Many soldiers retreated, some surrendered. Tecumseh and his warriors continued resisting from the forest. The fighting became fierce. Smoke filled the woods. Gunfire echoed beneath the autumn trees. During the battle, Tecumseh was killed. Exactly who fired the fatal shot remains uncertain. Several stories emerged afterward. None can be proven with complete confidence. What historians agree upon is that his death transformed the battle. Without Tecumseh's leadership, his Confederacy gradually dissolved. Many surviving warriors withdrew from the battlefield. The dream of a united native homeland suffered an enormous blow. General Harrison's victory became widely celebrated in the United States. For Native communities, the loss carried far deeper meaning. They had not simply lost a battle. They had lost one of the greatest leaders in their history. Even many American officers expressed respect for Tecumseh after his death. Years later, William Henry Harrison himself described him as one of the most remarkable men he had ever encountered. Historians today often reach similar conclusions. Tecumseh combined military skill with diplomatic vision. He sought cooperation rather than domination. His goal extended beyond victory in battle. He hoped to preserve the independence of native nations through unity. Although that dream ultimately remained unrealized, its legacy continues inspiring people today. The War of 1812 continued until 1815. The Treaty of Ghent restored peace between Britain and the United States, yet the treaty made no provision for an independent native territory. The alliance that Tecumseh had worked so tirelessly to build gradually faded. American settlement accelerated once again. Across the Southeast, new pressures now emerged. Rich farmland attracted increasing numbers of settlers. Political leaders debated how to acquire even more native land. Within only a few years, a new policy would reshape the lives of tens of thousands of native families. It would force entire nations from their ancestral homes. Its name would become forever linked with sorrow. The Indian Removal Act, and the long journey remembered today as the Trail of Tears. The death of Tecumseh marked the end of one remarkable chapter in the history of the American Indian Wars. Yet it did not bring peace to the American frontier. Instead, the young United States entered a period of astonishing growth. The War of 1812 had ended. The nation expanded steadily westward. New roads crossed the Appalachian Mountains. Steamboats carried settlers along mighty rivers. Entire towns appeared where only forests had stood a few years earlier. To many Americans, the frontier represented endless opportunity. To many native nations, it represented growing uncertainty. Nowhere was that uncertainty felt more deeply than in the southeastern United States. This region was home to what Americans of the time often called the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. The phrase reflected the language used during the 19th century, though historians today recognize that each of these nations possessed rich and sophisticated cultures long before European contact. Many communities had adapted to changing circumstances. They established schools, developed written constitutions, built farms, mills, and businesses. Some adopted European-style clothing. Others converted to Christianity while continuing to preserve important elements of their own traditions. The Cherokee Nation became especially well known for these efforts. One remarkable figure helped transform Cherokee society: Sequoyah. Although he never learned to read English, Sequoyah created a written syllabary for the Cherokee language during the early 1820s. It was an extraordinary achievement. For the first time, Cherokee people could read and write their own language. Literacy spread with remarkable speed. Soon, newspapers appeared, books were published, official government documents were written in Cherokee. The Cherokee Nation even established its own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. Many observers believe these developments demonstrated that peaceful coexistence between native nations and the United States remained possible. Yet events unfolding beyond Cherokee communities suggested otherwise. During the early 19th century, cotton became one of America's most profitable crops. Rich farmland throughout Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and neighboring states attracted increasing numbers of settlers. Demand for land grew rapidly. Then, in 1828, everything changed again. Gold was discovered in northern Georgia. Thousands of prospectors rushed into Cherokee territory almost overnight. Mining camps appeared. Roads multiplied. Pressure upon the Cherokee Nation intensified dramatically. At nearly the same time, Andrew Jackson became president of the United States. Jackson had built his national reputation through military victories during the Creek War and the Battle of New Orleans. He believed that relocating native nations west of the Mississippi River offered the best long-term solution for both native peoples and expanding American settlements. Many native leaders strongly disagreed. They argued that their nations already possessed established homelands protected by previous treaties. The debate became one of the most important political questions of the era. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The law authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties exchanging native lands in the east for territory west of the Mississippi River. Supporters argued that relocation would reduce future conflict. Opponents believed native nations should remain upon lands guaranteed by earlier agreements. Even within the United States, the policy generated intense disagreement. Missionaries, newspaper editors, members of Congress, and ordinary citizens expressed sharply different opinions. The Cherokee Nation chose to challenge the policy through the American legal system, led by Principal Chief John Ross. The Cherokee argued that they represented a sovereign nation protected by existing treaties. Their case eventually reached the Supreme Court. In 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall issued an important decision in Worcester versus Georgia. The court ruled that the state of Georgia possessed no authority to impose its laws within Cherokee territory. The decision appeared to support Cherokee sovereignty. Yet legal victories do not always guarantee political success. The ruling was never fully enforced. Pressure for removal continued. Within the Cherokee Nation itself, leaders struggled over how to respond. John Ross insisted that the vast majority of Cherokee people opposed relocation. Another smaller group believed removal had become unavoidable. In 1835, representatives from this minority signed the Treaty of New Echota. The treaty agreed to exchange Cherokee lands for territory in present-day Oklahoma. Most Cherokee citizens rejected the agreement. They argued that those who signed lacked authority to speak for the nation. The United States Senate nevertheless ratified the treaty. Its terms required removal within 2 years. As the deadline approached, many Cherokee families hoped negotiations might still produce another solution. Instead, federal troops arrived during the spring of 1838. Soldiers entered Cherokee communities throughout Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. Families received little time to gather belongings. Many were escorted to temporary camps while preparations for removal continued. The camps soon became overcrowded. Summer heat increased suffering. Illness spread quickly. Months passed before the long journey west finally began. The route covered nearly 1,000 miles. Some groups traveled by river, most walked. Autumn gradually gave way to winter. Cold rain soaked clothing. Roads turned to mud. Snow covered portions of the trail. Food sometimes became scarce. Children grew tired. Elderly people struggled to continue. Mothers carried infants through freezing weather. Fathers tried to encourage exhausted families, despite their own uncertainty. Different Cherokee groups traveled along several routes. Not every experience was identical. Some journeys proceeded more smoothly than others, yet all shared the same painful reality. They were leaving behind homes their ancestors had known for countless generations. Churches, schools, farms, family graves, ancient mountains, flowing rivers. Everything familiar slowly disappeared behind them. Historians estimate that approximately 16,000 Cherokee people were forced to relocate. Thousands did not survive the journey or the difficult months surrounding removal because of disease exposure and hardship. The exact number remains uncertain. What remains beyond dispute is that the removal brought profound suffering to the Cherokee Nation. Today, the journey is remembered as the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee were not the only nation affected. The Choctaw had already begun moving west in the early 1830s. The Creek followed. The Chickasaw eventually negotiated removal under somewhat different terms. Many Seminole people resisted entirely. Rather than leaving Florida, they prepared to fight. The swamps, rivers, and dense forests of the Florida Peninsula would soon become the setting for one of the longest and most expensive conflicts in American history. Unlike the open battlefields of earlier wars, this struggle would unfold beneath towering cypress trees, across flooded marshes, and through landscapes where the environment itself became one of the greatest challenges. There, a remarkable Seminole leader named Osceola would emerge. His name would soon become known throughout the United States, and the American Indian Wars would enter yet another unforgettable chapter. As thousands of Cherokee families slowly made their way west along the Trail of Tears, another conflict was already unfolding much farther south. The landscape could not have been more different. Instead of towering Appalachian mountains, Florida offered endless wetlands, dense forests of cypress and pine, slow-moving rivers, hidden lakes and vast stretches of sawgrass that shimmered beneath the warm southern sun. For newcomers unfamiliar with the region, the land itself seemed almost impossible to cross. But for the Seminole people, it was home. The Seminole Nation had formed over many generations. Its ancestors included Creek families who had gradually moved into Florida during the 18th century. They were joined by people from other native nations. Some formerly enslaved African Americans also found refuge among Seminole communities, creating unique and enduring relationships that distinguish the Seminole from many other native nations. Together, they built villages scattered across the forests and wetlands. They farmed, hunted, raised cattle, and adapted remarkably well to the challenging environment. For many years, Spanish Florida had remained beyond the reach of the expanding United States. That changed in 1821. Spain transferred Florida to the United States under the Adams-Onis Treaty. Almost immediately, American officials began encouraging greater settlement throughout the territory. As more settlers arrived, pressure increased upon Seminole lands. Government leaders expected the Seminole to relocate west of the Mississippi River, following the same policies already affecting other native nations. Many Seminole leaders refused. They had no desire to abandon their homes. At first, negotiations continued, treaties were discussed, meetings took place beneath shade trees and inside military forts. Some Seminole chiefs believed relocation might eventually become unavoidable. Others rejected the idea completely. The disagreements reflected the difficult choices facing every native community during this period. Among those who opposed removal most strongly was a young warrior named Osceola. Interestingly, Osceola was not born a principal chief. His influence came not from hereditary leadership, but from his courage, determination, and ability to inspire others. Those who met him often described him as calm, intelligent, and deeply devoted to protecting his people. As tensions grew, his reputation spread throughout Florida. In 1832, several Seminole representatives signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing. The agreement proposed relocating the Seminole to lands west of the Mississippi. Yet many later argued that the treaty had not reflected the wishes of the broader Seminole nation. Confusion followed. Different interpretations emerged. Some leaders accepted relocation. Others insisted the treaty lacked legitimacy. American officials expected the Seminole to leave. Many Seminole villages quietly prepared to resist instead. By late 1835, the fragile peace collapsed. On December 23rd, a small group of Seminole warriors attacked Major Francis Dade and approximately 100 American soldiers marching through central Florida. The soldiers had been traveling from Fort Brooke to reinforce another military post. The narrow trail wound through forests and open pine lands. Unknown to the soldiers, Seminole warriors had carefully observed their movement for days. The attack came suddenly, within minutes. The peaceful forest echoed with gunfire. The engagement became known as Dade's Battle or the Dade Massacre. Depending upon the historical source, only a handful of American soldiers survived. News spread rapidly throughout the United States. Many Americans were shocked. The Second Seminole War had begun. It would become the longest, most difficult, and most expensive of all the American Indian Wars. The United States Army soon discovered that Florida presented extraordinary military challenges. Conventional tactics rarely worked. European-style battlefields hardly existed. Instead, soldiers found themselves moving through waist-deep water, crossing swamps filled with thick vegetation, battling clouds of mosquitoes beneath exhausting summer heat. Roads disappeared. Trails ended suddenly. Visibility remained limited. Seminole warriors knew every river, every hidden island, every dry hammock rising slightly above the flooded marshes. Rather than seeking large battles, they relied upon surprise. Small groups struck quickly before disappearing into the wilderness. American soldiers often pursued shadows. Entire days passed without seeing an opponent. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted from dense palmetto thickets. The Seminole vanished before organized pursuit became possible. This style of warfare frustrated even experienced officers. Osceola quickly became the best-known face of the resistance. Stories about him appeared in newspapers throughout the country. Some accounts exaggerated his actions. Others turned him into a legendary figure. Yet those who actually encountered him generally agreed upon one point: he possessed remarkable leadership. His followers admired his courage. Even several American officers later expressed respect for him. As the conflict continued, the United States committed increasing numbers of troops. Thousands of soldiers rotated through Florida. Engineers built roads, constructed forts, improved supply lines. Steamboats patrolled rivers whenever possible. Despite these efforts, progress remained painfully slow. Months became years. The war consumed enormous financial resources. Many soldiers suffered more from disease than combat. Malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses spread easily through the humid climate. For both sides, the environment proved almost as dangerous as the fighting itself. American commanders increasingly searched for alternative strategies. If Osceola could be captured, perhaps resistance would weaken. In October 1837, a controversial meeting was arranged. Osceola agreed to attend negotiations under a flag of truce near Fort Powhatan. Traditionally, a flag of truce represented safe passage for diplomatic discussions. Instead, American forces arrested Osceola during the meeting. The decision immediately became controversial. Many observers questioned whether such an arrest honored accepted customs of negotiation. Even at the time, opinions differed sharply. Osceola was transported first to St. Augustine, then later to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. Although imprisoned, he remained widely respected. Artists painted his portrait. Visitors requested meetings. Newspapers continued reporting on his condition. Sadly, he never regained his freedom. In January 1838, Osceola died after becoming ill. He was only in his early 30s. His death dealt a heavy emotional blow to many Seminole people. Yet remarkably, the war did not end. Other leaders stepped forward: Cocucci, Alligator, Sam Jones, Billy Bowlegs. The resistance continued for several more years. The United States Army struggled to force the remaining Seminole from Florida. Eventually, thousands were relocated west to present-day Oklahoma, yet not everyone left. Small groups retreated deeper into the Everglades. There, hidden among endless marshes and cypress forests, they survived. Their descendants remain in Florida today. The Second Seminole War officially ended in 1842. Although fighting continued sporadically for years afterward, the United States never completely removed the Seminole from Florida. It remains one of the few native nations that was never entirely forced from its ancestral homeland. As the swamps of Florida slowly grew quiet once more, attention shifted far to the west, beyond the Mississippi, across the Great Plains. A different world awaited. There, millions of buffalo still roamed beneath endless skies. Powerful nations such as the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche controlled vast stretches of grassland. For a time, distance protected their way of life. But new wagon trail, gold discoveries, and the coming of the railroad would soon carry the American frontier into the heart of the plains. The greatest battles of the American Indian Wars were still yet to come. By the middle of the 19th century, the American frontier had reached the Great Plains, stretching from present-day Texas to Canada. The plains formed one of the largest grassland ecosystems on Earth. Rolling waves of prairie grass reached toward distant horizons. The sky seemed almost endless. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, and beneath that enormous sky, millions of buffalo moved across the land in great seasonal migrations. To travelers arriving from the forests of the east, the plains appeared almost empty, yet nothing could have been further from the truth. This vast landscape was home to powerful native nations whose lives had become deeply connected to the buffalo: the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Blackfeet, and many others. For generations, these nations had mastered life upon the open prairie. The arrival of horses during the 17th and 18th centuries had transformed the plains forever. Native horsemen became among the finest riders in the world. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Hunters pursued buffalo across the grasslands with extraordinary skill. Warriors traveled hundreds of miles with remarkable speed. Entire communities moved with the changing seasons. The buffalo stood at the center of this world. Food, clothing, shelter, tools, everything came from the great herds. Buffalo hides became warm robes and teepee coverings. Bones became tools. Sinew became thread. Nothing was wasted. The rhythm of life followed the movement of the animals. As long as the buffalo remained, the plains nations flourished. For several decades, and the immense grasslands remained beyond the reach of large American settlements. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had dramatically expanded the territory of the United States. But owning land on a map and controlling it were two very different things. The plains remained largely under native control. American explorers, trappers, and fur traders traveled through the region. Some established peaceful trading relationships. Forts such as Bent's Fort along the Arkansas River became important centers where native peoples, American traders, and Mexican merchants exchanged horses, buffalo robes, tools, blankets, and other goods. For a time, trade often proved more important than conflict, yet change was approaching. In the 1840s, thousands of settlers began moving west along the Oregon Trail. Soon followed the California Trail. Long wagon trains stretched across the prairie. Families traveled with oxen, wagons, livestock, and hopes for a better future. Each spring, the trails filled once again. At first, many native nations welcomed the travelers. Some offered fresh food, others traded horses, or guided immigrants across difficult river crossings. The wagon trains usually passed quickly. Few people imagined that these temporary roads would soon become permanent routes of expansion. Then, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Everything changed. The California gold rush attracted hundreds of thousands of people. The wagon trails became crowded. New settlements appeared across the plains. The United States government established additional military forts to protect travelers. Every new fort brought more soldiers. Every new settlement required more land. Gradually, the balance began shifting. American officials hoped to avoid unnecessary conflict. In 1851, representatives from numerous Plains nations gathered near Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. The meeting became one of the largest treaty councils in American history. Thousands attended: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Mandan, Hidatsa, Assiniboine, and many others. The Treaty of Fort Laramie attempted to establish boundaries between different native territories while guaranteeing safe passage for settlers along the wagon trails. In return, the United States promised annual payments and recognized large areas as native land. For a brief time, many believed the agreement might preserve peace. Unfortunately, the frontier changed faster than the treaty could keep pace. More settlers arrived every year. Gold discoveries continued drawing prospectors westward. Some ignored treaty boundaries entirely. Military commanders struggled to prevent small disputes from becoming larger conflicts. One tragic incident in 1854 demonstrated how quickly violence could spread. Near Fort Laramie, a Mormon immigrant reported that a cow had wandered away and been killed. The animal had apparently entered a Lakota camp. According to Lakota custom, compensation could have settled the matter peacefully. Instead, a young Army officer named Lieutenant John Grattan attempted to arrest the individual believed responsible. The situation rapidly escalated. Misunderstandings multiplied. Neither side fully understood the other's expectations. Gunfire erupted. Grattan and his entire command were killed. The event became known as the Grattan Fight. Although relatively small in scale, it marked the beginning of years of increasing tension across the northern plains. The following decade brought even greater change. In 1858, gold was discovered in present-day Colorado. Once again, thousands rushed westward. Many crossed lands guaranteed to the Cheyenne and Arapaho under earlier treaties. Mining camps quickly grew into permanent towns. Roads multiplied. The buffalo herds gradually retreated from heavily traveled areas. Native leaders watched familiar hunting grounds shrink. Despite these challenges, many continued seeking peaceful solutions. One respected Southern Cheyenne chief became especially well known for his efforts, Black Kettle. He consistently argued that cooperation offered the best hope for his people. Even during times of growing tension, he believed negotiation remained possible, yet peace requires trust on both sides, and trust had become increasingly difficult to maintain. As the American Civil War consumed much of the nation's attention, violence occasionally flared across the plains. Some native groups raided isolated settlements. Some volunteer militia units responded harshly. Fear spread through frontier communities. Rumors often traveled faster than accurate information. Then, on November 29, 1864, one of the darkest moments in the history of the American Indian Wars occurred. Black Kettle and his followers had established a camp beside Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. They believed they were under the protection of the United States Army. An American flag reportedly flew above the village alongside a white flag of truce. Before dawn, Colonel John Chivington led several hundred Colorado volunteer soldiers toward the camp. What followed became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The attack brought terrible loss of life, including many women, children, and elderly people. Even several American officers later condemned what had happened. Congressional investigations followed. The event shocked many people throughout the United States. For Native communities across the plains, Sand Creek became a turning point. Many who had previously hoped for peaceful coexistence now questioned whether treaties alone could provide security. Young warriors who had witnessed the destruction carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Among them were future leaders whose names would later become famous. The road toward peace had grown far more difficult. The Civil War would soon end. The Transcontinental Railroad would begin crossing the plains. The buffalo herds would face increasing pressure, and a new generation of Lakota and Cheyenne leaders, including Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, would soon rise to defend their homelands. The greatest struggles of the Plains Wars were only beginning. The tragedy at Sand Creek echoed across the Great Plains. Word spread quickly from one native camp to another. Messengers rode across the open prairie carrying news of what had happened. Many communities had already questioned whether peace treaties could truly protect their people. Now, those doubts grew even stronger. Among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, a younger generation of leaders began to emerge. They had grown up watching the frontier move steadily westward. They had witnessed broken promises, shrinking hunting grounds, and the steady disappearance of the buffalo from areas once filled with life. 3 names would soon become known throughout North America: Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull. Although each possessed a different personality and leadership style, all shared one common goal: protect the lands of their people. The first great challenge centered upon a lonely route stretching through present-day Wyoming, the Bozeman Trail. Discovered during the gold rush in Montana during the early 1860s, the trail offered settlers and miners a shorter route to the goldfields. Unfortunately, it crossed directly through the Powder River country. To the Lakota, this was not simply another piece of land. It was one of the richest buffalo hunting regions on the northern plains. The valleys, the rivers, the rolling grasslands, everything essential to their way of life existed there. Every wagon traveling the Bozeman Trail brought more outsiders into the heart of Lakota territory. The United States Army responded by constructing a series of forts to protect travelers. Among them were Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith. To American officials, these forts represented security. To Red Cloud, they represented permanent occupation. Unlike many leaders who had accepted earlier treaties, Red Cloud refused to sign agreements allowing military forts inside Lakota hunting grounds. Instead, he chose resistance. Beginning in 1866, war spread across the Powder River country. The conflict later became known as Red Cloud's War. Unlike large battles fought across open fields, most fighting took place along lonely trails, winding through forests and rolling hills. Small groups of soldiers escorting supply wagons frequently found themselves under attack. Native warriors rarely remained in one place for long. They knew every creek, every ridge, every hidden valley. The land itself became their greatest ally. One young warrior especially distinguished himself during these campaigns: Crazy Horse. Even as a young man, he displayed extraordinary courage. Quiet by nature, he rarely sought attention. Unlike many famous leaders, he disliked boasting. He believed actions spoke louder than words. Other warriors admired both his skill and his calm determination. As the conflict continued, the American garrisons found themselves increasingly isolated. Fort Phil Kearny became especially vulnerable. Its soldiers depended upon nearby forests for construction timber and firewood. Almost every day, wagon parties left the fort to cut logs. Almost every day, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors watched their movements carefully. Then, on December 21st, 1866, one of the most famous battles of the Plains Wars unfolded. That morning, a small group of native warriors appeared near the fort. Among them was Crazy Horse. The warriors rode boldly within sight of the soldiers before turning away. The display seemed almost reckless. To Colonel Henry Carrington, it looked like another small raid. Captain William J. Fetterman received orders to protect the wood train, but not to pursue the attackers beyond a nearby ridge. Fetterman believed his experienced soldiers could easily defeat the warriors before them. Ignoring his instructions, he followed the retreating riders. What he did not know was that the apparent retreat had been carefully planned. Crazy Horse and the others were drawing the soldiers into an ambush. As Fetterman's command crossed the ridge, hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors suddenly appeared. The soldiers found themselves completely surrounded. The battle lasted only a short time. When it ended, every member of Fetterman's command had been killed. For the United States Army, the defeat came as a profound shock. It demonstrated once again that experienced native warriors understood the plains far better than their opponents. Throughout the following year, Red Cloud's war continued. Supply routes remained dangerous. The forts required constant protection. Neither side achieved a decisive military victory. Yet Washington increasingly questioned whether maintaining the Bozeman Trail justified the growing cost. Finally, in 1868, representatives gathered to negotiate a new agreement. The Treaty of Fort Laramie became one of the most significant treaties in the history of the American West. The United States agreed to abandon the forts along the Bozeman Trail. The Powder River country was recognized as unceded hunting territory. The Great Sioux Reservation was established, including the Black Hills. For Red Cloud, it represented an extraordinary achievement. Unlike many previous conflicts, this war had ended largely on native terms. The abandoned forts were burned after the soldiers departed. For a brief moment, peace returned to the northern plains. Yet beneath the surface, new pressures already waited. Farther south, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed in 1869. Steel rails now connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Towns appeared almost overnight beside the tracks. Buffalo hunters increasingly entered the plains. Their rifles grew more accurate. Commercial demand for buffalo hides expanded rapidly. Within only a few years, the enormous herds that had sustained plains cultures for generations began disappearing. The consequences proved devastating. Without the buffalo, traditional life became increasingly difficult. At almost the same time, another discovery transformed the West forever. In 1874, an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer entered the Black Hills. Although the region had been guaranteed to the Lakota under the Treaty of Fort Laramie, the expedition reported something extraordinary: gold, almost immediately. Prospectors poured into the Black Hills. Mining camps appeared, roads multiplied. The United States government attempted to purchase the land. Many Lakota leaders refused. The Black Hills held profound spiritual significance. They were not simply valuable land, they were sacred. Negotiations failed. Tension grew. Government officials eventually demanded that all Lakota bands report to reservations. Several groups, including those led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, remained upon their traditional hunting grounds. The government declared them hostile. The stage was now set for one of the most famous campaigns in American history, the Great Sioux War of 1876. Its most remembered battle would take place beside a quiet river in present-day Montana. There, the 7th Cavalry, led by George Armstrong Custer, would meet an alliance of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, unlike any previously assembled on the plains. The name of that river would forever become part of American history, the Little Bighorn. During the summer of 1876, the Northern Great Plains became the center of one of the most famous campaigns in American history. The United States government had ordered all Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands to report to their assigned reservations. Many complied. Others remained where they had always lived. Some continued following the buffalo herds across the open prairie. Among those who stayed beyond the reservation boundaries were leaders whose names had already become well known: Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Gall, Lame White Man, Two Moons. Their villages gathered along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. Families pitched hundreds of teepees beside the winding water. Children played along the riverbanks. Women prepared food. Hunters returned with buffalo. Although many understood that soldiers might eventually arrive, daily life continued much as it had for generations. The village itself was enormous, perhaps the largest gathering of Plains people ever recorded. Historians continue debating the exact population. Some estimates suggest nearly 10,000 people camped along the valley. Several thousand warriors stood ready if needed. It was a remarkable community brought together during the summer buffalo hunt. Far away, the United States Army prepared its own campaign. Military leaders believed that several coordinated columns would surround the native villages before they could escape. One of those columns belonged to Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Custer had become one of the most recognizable officers in America. During the Civil War, his bold cavalry charges had earned him national fame. His long blonde hair, confident personality, and dramatic battlefield reputation attracted constant newspaper attention. Now, he led the 7th Cavalry westward across Montana. The soldiers rode through rolling grasslands beneath enormous skies. Dust rose behind hundreds of horses. Scouts searched constantly for signs of the villages. Among those scouts were Crow and Arikara men serving with the army. They understood the landscape far better than most soldiers. Several warned that the native encampment appeared unusually large. Exactly how many people waited ahead remained uncertain. On June 25, 1876, Custer located the village. Concerned that it might disperse if he waited, he decided to attack immediately rather than waiting for additional forces. Historians have debated this decision for nearly a century and a half. Some believe Custer feared losing the opportunity. Others argue he underestimated the size of the village. Whatever his reasoning, the decision would shape history. Rather than attacking together, Custer divided his regiment into several groups. Major Marcus Reno received 1 battalion, Captain Frederick Benteen another. Custer personally led the remainder. The plan reflected common cavalry tactics of the era. Separate forces could strike from multiple directions against smaller villages. Such methods had often succeeded, but this village was not small. As Reno approached the southern end of the encampment, he quickly realized the scale of what lay before him. Hundreds of warriors emerged. The attack slowed, then faltered. Reno ordered his men to retreat toward nearby timber before eventually reaching the bluffs overlooking the river. Meanwhile, Custer continued moving north. Exactly what happened during the next hour remains one of history's enduring mysteries. No American soldiers survived from Custer's immediate command to describe the fighting. Instead, historians rely upon native eyewitness accounts, archaeological evidence, and reports from soldiers elsewhere on the battlefield. Together, they reveal a battle far more complex than early legends often suggested. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors responded with extraordinary speed. Crazy Horse led bold counterattacks. Gall organized resistance after members of his own family had been killed during the opening stages of the battle. Other leaders quickly directed warriors toward Custer's isolated companies, rather than facing only a few defenders. The 7th Cavalry encountered overwhelming numbers. The fighting moved across ridges overlooking the Little Bighorn River. Soldiers attempted to establish defensive positions. Some dismounted. Others fought from horseback. Dust, smoke, and confusion spread across the hills. Within a relatively short time, Custer and approximately 200 of his men had been killed. The Battle of the Little Bighorn ended as one of the greatest native victories in American history. News reached the eastern United States during celebrations marking the nation's centennial. The reaction was immediate. Newspapers across the country published dramatic headlines. Many Americans mourned the loss of Custer and his soldiers. For Native communities, the battle represented a remarkable moment of unity and determination. Yet victory also carried unexpected consequences. Rather than ending the conflict, Little Bighorn encouraged the United States government to commit even greater military resources to the plains. Additional troops entered the region, supply lines expanded, campaigns continued throughout the following months. The buffalo herds kept shrinking, winter approached, food became increasingly scarce. Many native families recognized that remaining constantly on the move would become more difficult. During the winter of 1876 and the following spring, several bands gradually surrendered and entered reservations. Crazy Horse continued resisting longer than many others. His reputation grew with every passing month. He rarely sought fame, He never allowed photographs to be taken. He spoke little, yet his courage inspired deep respect among both his own people and many of his opponents. Eventually, in May 1877, recognizing the growing hardship facing his people, Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson in Nebraska. He hoped peace might finally allow his community to survive. Tragically, only a few months later, tension developed between military authorities and several Lakota leaders. Rumors spread, misunderstandings multiplied. During an attempt to place him under arrest, Crazy Horse was fatally wounded on September 5, 1877. He died later that evening. He was believed to be about 36 years old. His family quietly buried him in a location that remains unknown today. Sitting Bull chose a different path, with many followers. He crossed into Canada for several years. They lived north of the international border, hoping distance might preserve their independence. Life proved difficult. Buffalo became scarce there as well. Eventually, in 1881, Sitting Bull returned to the United States and surrendered peacefully. The great era of free-roaming plains life was drawing to a close. The buffalo, once numbering in the tens of millions, had been reduced to only a tiny fraction of their former population. Railroads crossed the continent. New ranches covered the prairie. Reservations became home to most surviving plains nations. Yet one final movement would soon spread across native communities. It promised hope during a time of despair. It spoke of renewal, of peace, of a world where the buffalo would return and loved ones would be reunited. The movement became known as the Ghost Dance. Its message inspired thousands. Its ending would become one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the history of the American Indian Wars. By the closing years of the 19th century, the American frontier had changed almost beyond recognition. The endless wagon trains that once crossed the Great Plains had been replaced by railroads. Steel tracks stretched from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Telegraph wires connected distant towns. New cities appeared where buffalo once grazed. The great herds, once numbering in the tens of millions, had nearly vanished. For the Plains nations, the transformation had happened within a single generation. Children who had once followed buffalo hunts across open grasslands now found themselves growing up on reservations. Many native families faced enormous challenges, adapting to a rapidly changing world. Government agencies distributed food and supplies. Schools were established. Some encouraged farming. Others promoted new ways of life very different from long-held traditions. Across the plains, many communities struggled to preserve their languages, ceremonies, and cultural identity while facing uncertain futures. Yet hope has always found ways to survive. Around 1889, a Paiute spiritual leader from present-day Nevada named Wovoka shared a message that spread quickly across native communities. Following a profound spiritual vision, Wovoka taught that peace, kindness, and honesty would help bring renewal to the world. He encouraged people to avoid violence, to care for one another, to live honorably. One important part of his message involved a ceremonial dance. Participants believed that through prayer and the ghost dance, the world could one day be restored. Some hoped the buffalo would return. Others believed loved ones who had passed away would one day be reunited with them. Still, others dreamed of a future where native peoples could once again live peacefully according to their traditions. It was a message born from hope during a time of extraordinary hardship. As the movement spread, different communities interpreted Wovoka's teachings in different ways. Among many Lakota people, the ghost dance carried especially deep emotional meaning. Years of loss, broken treaties, the disappearance of the buffalo, and life upon reservations had created profound uncertainty. The ceremonies offered comfort, community, faith. Many participants believed a better future remained possible. American officials observed the growing movement with increasing concern. Some misunderstood its purpose. Rumors spread that the ghost dance represented preparation for armed resistance. Fear often grows most quickly where understanding is absent. Reservation agents sent urgent reports to Washington. Military commanders prepared additional troops. Many historians now believe these fears greatly exaggerated the actual intentions of most ghost dance participants. Nevertheless, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Among those watched closely by government authorities was Sitting Bull. Years had passed since the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He had returned peacefully from Canada. For a time, he even traveled with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, allowing audiences across America to see one of the plains' most respected leaders. Eventually, he returned to Standing Rock Reservation. Although Sitting Bull did not create the ghost dance movement, many Lakota admired him deeply. Officials feared his influence might encourage resistance. On December 15, 1890, a reservation police attempted to arrest Sitting Bull. During the confusion, gunfire erupted. Exactly how the shooting began remains uncertain. When it ended, Sitting Bull had been killed. His death sent shockwaves throughout Lakota communities. Many families feared additional arrests might soon follow. One group, led by Chief Spotted Elk, often remembered by the English name Bigfoot, decided to travel toward Pine Ridge Reservation. Spotted Elk himself was seriously ill with pneumonia. Despite his condition, the journey continued through bitter winter weather. Snow covered the plains. Cold winds swept across the open grasslands. The travelers hoped only to reach safety. On December 28th, United States Army soldiers intercepted the group near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. Approximately 300 Lakota men, women, and children camped under military supervision. The following morning, December 29th, 1890, soldiers began collecting weapons. The atmosphere remained uneasy. Neither side fully trusted the other. Then, a gun discharged. Historians still debate exactly how the first shot occurred. Within moments, chaos overwhelmed the camp. Gunfire echoed across the snowy valley. Many Lakota attempted to flee. Soldiers struggled to control the rapidly unfolding situation. When the shooting finally ended, a great many Lakota people had lost their lives, including women and children. Several soldiers were also killed, many likely by friendly fire during the confusion. Today, Wounded Knee is remembered as one of the most tragic events in American history. Rather than representing a great battle, it stands as a painful reminder of how fear, misunderstanding, and mistrust can lead to devastating consequences. For many historians, Wounded Knee symbolizes the closing chapter of the American Indian Wars. Although occasional conflicts occurred afterward, the long era of large-scale frontier warfare had effectively come to an end. Yet history did not stop there. The native nations endured, communities rebuilt, languages survived, ceremonies continued, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly. Parents taught children the stories of their ancestors. Grandparents preserved songs that had been sung for countless generations. During the 20th century, important changes slowly unfolded. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted United States citizenship to all Native Americans born within the country, although many states continued restricting voting rights for years afterward. Later decades brought renewed efforts to protect Native cultures and tribal sovereignty. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 encouraged greater tribal self-government. The civil rights movement inspired many Native activists to advocate for treaty rights, education, and cultural preservation. Across the country, traditional languages began experiencing renewed interest. Museums increasingly worked alongside Native communities. Sacred sites gained greater legal protection. Today, more than 500 federally recognized Native nations continue enriching the cultural life of the United States. Ancient traditions remain alive. Powwows celebrate music and dance. Artists preserve centuries-old techniques while creating new works. Historians continue uncovering stories once overlooked. The American Indian Wars remain one of the longest chapters in North American history. They cannot be understood simply as victories or defeats, nor as stories belonging to only one people. They are stories of courage, loss, determination, misunderstanding, adaptation, and resilience. They remind us that history is rarely simple. Different people often viewed the same events through entirely different experiences. Understanding those perspectives helps us see the past with greater compassion. As our own quiet journey now comes to an end, imagine standing once more upon the Great Plains. The sun is slowly setting beyond the distant horizon. A gentle breeze moves through tall prairie grass. An eagle circles high above the open sky. The sounds of the modern world seem very far away. For just a moment, you can almost imagine the great buffalo herds returning, their distant footsteps rolling softly across the earth like approaching thunder. Campfires begin glowing beneath the evening sky. Stories are shared between generations. Children listen quietly as elders speak of the past. The stars slowly appear, one by one, just as they have for thousands of years. Though the centuries have changed the landscape, the rivers still flow, the mountains still stand, the prairie still dances beneath the wind, and the voices of history continue to whisper to those willing to listen. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through the history of the American Indian Wars. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I hope you'll return for another quiet evening with Whispered History, where together we'll continue exploring the remarkable people, places, and moments that shaped our world. Until next time, may your evening be peaceful, may your dreams be gentle, and may history softly carry you into a restful sleep. Good night.